All right, hello everybody. I want to do a little overview of a sheet, a one-page sheet called Philosophical Ethics: Almost Everything You Need to Know. And I recommend you download the file and print it out too. Um, this is now available at makingmoralprogress.blogspot.com. I was paying for the domain for a while, but I stopped paying for it. So you can get it there, and it's probably on your syllabus, but you can find it however in lots of places. So lots of classes get tons and tons and tons of concepts. And one thing that happens when you get tons and tons and tons of concepts is eventually you forget them. So in this class, I try to give us just a few concepts that are really powerful and really useful, and we can practice them throughout the course. And you'll get skills in thinking from practicing these concepts that you can use for thinking about everything down the road. So we got a few ideas, and so that we'll do a lot with. So they're all on this sheet. All right. So I just want to point out there's two very important questions in thinking about moral issues that we'll ask over and over again, and you should start asking over and over again. They are, why think that, and what do you mean? The why think that question is basically a question that suggests what we're looking for is arguments. People say things, we ask why. Well, why think that? And the that is like their conclusion, the why is their premises. So this class is all about arguments, philosophy is all about arguments, ethics is all about arguments. So we want to know why people accept various conclusions and basically figure out whether their reasons are any good or not. And that includes things that we think. We can ask about ourselves, well, why do I think that? Do I have any good reason for thinking that? The next question is, what do you mean? Especially in thinking about ethical issues, people use a lot of words that their meanings are not clear. And one thing we will do in this class a lot is step back and think, what do people mean by that word? Another thing is that people sometimes are imprecise in what they say. Suppose somebody says, men are like this, women are like that, students are like this. Well, are you saying, all men are like that, some women are like that, every possible student is like that? And that's really important too. So in asking what do you mean, we want to know about the meanings of words, defining words, and we also want to be precise. All right, so the why think that question takes us to arguments. And here's what an argument is. An argument is a conclusion supported by premises or a premise that supports a conclusion. It's a conclusion supported by reasons. That's the idea. So what are conclusions? Your conclusion is just your main point. And in our case, our main point is typically that doing something is wrong, doing something is morally permissible, which means it's not wrong to do it, or that doing something is a moral obligation, which means it's wrong to not do it. Somebody might think it's a moral obligation to save somebody's life when you can very easily do so. Basically, that means it would be wrong to not save their life in that circumstance. So you notice that we don't really have the word right. That's because we can ask, what do you mean about the word right? And sometimes when people say right, they mean permissible. Other times they mean obligatory. Since one of our goals is to have better concepts for thinking about things, we're going to use our better words of permissible and obligatory. Okay, so we have the idea of an argument, and arguments can be good and bad in different ways. And one way an argument can be good is that it's called logically valid. Logically valid means the premises lead to the conclusion. It means if the premises are true, then the conclusion is true. Why is that? Because the premises lead to the conclusion. When we want our arguments to be logically valid, and we also want it to be obvious that they're logically valid. So let me give you an example. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. We have a conclusion, we have a premise, but we don't really have this in valid form. If you add to this premise, or add to the first premise, the premise that all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, so therefore Socrates is mortal, or if someone is a man, then that someone's mortal, Socrates is a man, so he's mortal, well, that will take you to the conclusion, and that is an example of a logically valid argument. So if you add in a premise that's needed to really complete the reasoning and make it obvious what the reasoning is, you've made the argument valid. So one pattern of valid arguments is called a syllogism. I have a video that I've asked you to watch, or I will ask you to watch, or I suggest that you watch on YouTube called Moral Syllogisms. And it's all about how many common moral arguments fit this pattern of a syllogism. And it provides guidance on how to make a syllogism so that you can find all the premises so you can think about them. There's another common pattern called modus ponens and another pattern called modus tollens. Modus ponens says if P then Q, P therefore Q. Modus tollens says if P then Q, not Q, so therefore not P. So modus tollens is often very helpful for kind of thinking through an idea. And if you think through an idea and see or claim and see that something false follows from it, you can tell that the initial claim is false. So it's kind of like this. Suppose somebody says, only brown-eyed people have the right to life. You could think, well, if only brown-eyed people have the right to life, then blue-eyed people don't have the right to life. But blue-eyed people do have the right to life, so it's not true that brown-eyed people have a right to life. So modus tollens is really helpful for kind of testing ideas. See what follows from them. If something is false, or if something false follows from them, then the initial claim is false. All right. So there's the idea of a logically valid argument, and here are 3 common logically valid argument patterns. There are also some common invalid patterns, and we'll want to talk about those eventually. One of them is called denying the antecedent, another is called affirming the consequent. All right, next concept is that of a sound argument. A sound argument is a logically valid argument with true premises. And since logically valid means if the premises are true, then the conclusion is true, well, if you got a valid argument with true premises, that would mean the conclusion is true. So we're going to be looking at moral arguments for the most part. So these are arguments that have moral conclusions about doing whatever's wrong or permissible or obligatory. And many times such arguments have factual or scientific premises, and we need to figure out whether those are true or not. They also tend to have moral principles, and we'll talk about those soon enough. And moral principles are kind of like a rule. And the way you try to think about whether a rule is a good one is you kind of try to think about, does it seem to help you make sense of things? Does it seem to explain things? And next, can you find any counterexamples to it? Like an exception to, a good exception to the rule. So if you can find a good exception to the rule, that suggests it's not a good rule. So let me just offer up this principle. Suppose somebody says, any action that's fun for me to do is a morally permissible action. Well, you could think, no, there could easily be counterexamples here. You know, you might find doing all sorts of awful things to be fun, but doing those awful things is wrong. So that's not a good principle. All right, next concept. There's the idea of an action being prima facie wrong, or prima facie permissible, or prima facie obligatory. Prima facie means this. It's like, this is a good idea in general, but there might be some exceptions. So we could think about this. Killing people. Killing people seems to be prima facie wrong, meaning it's wrong in most circumstances, but there could be some circumstances where killing somebody is okay. Now, I hope we're never in these circumstances, but it's like, look, killing somebody is wrong unless, you know, if they're attacking you and the only way you can save your life is killing them, well, I guess that would be okay. But if you're not in a circumstance like that, that would be wrong. So this idea of prima facie. Prima facie, to say that something's prima facie wrong is to say it's wrong in most circumstances. Next, many arguments, or some arguments, are called question-begging arguments. They are arguments that beg the question. A question-begging argument is an argument where the conclusion is assumed by a premise. Basically, the reason that you give in favor of a conclusion just assumes that conclusion. So it's kind of like this. Let me give you just some example. suppose somebody says, conclusion, it's wrong to eat meat. You ask them, well, why think that? Well, because it's not permissible to eat meat. That reason that it's not permissible to eat meat just assumes that it's wrong to eat meat. So on many topics, question-begging arguments are given. Okay, I'm going to skip over the idea of necessary, sufficient, and necessary and sufficient conditions. We'll get to that later. If you want to find out about those now, you could Google it and find some good stuff. All right, finally, I want to just note that the law and ethics are different. Just because the law prohibits something doesn't mean it's morally wrong. Just because the law requires something doesn't make it morally permissible or morally obligatory. So the law and morality are different. Next, I want to just observe that religion and ethics are different. Just because some religion says something's okay doesn't mean it is. Just because some religion says something is wrong doesn't mean it's wrong. So we'll talk about that a little bit down the road. Third, just because something is a tradition, something we've been doing for a long time, that does not make it okay. Sometimes people say, like, well, that's just what we do around here. Well, but that doesn't prove that it's permissible. Okay. Finally, that we or anybody likes doing something doesn't make doing that something okay. A goal in this class is to sort of learn what morality is, what morality or ethics requires of us. And at the very least, just because we like something doesn't make it okay. All right, so this is a start on some of the basic concepts that we'll need. And we will be using these concepts throughout the class, continually asking why I think that, continually asking what do you mean. You'll want to start asking this all the time about everything in your life. And our main goal will be looking at arguments. What's the conclusion? What are the premises? What reasons are given for this? We'll want to spell out that argument, that reasoning in its full structure so we can see all the assumptions. And then we're going to want to think about, well, those things that you say in favor of that conclusion, are they claims that are true or false? And how do we figure that out? So that's a brief overview of some of our most important concepts, and we'll be practicing these throughout our class. Thank you.